My name is Colleen Johnson, and I'm the Enterprise Agile Coach at ReadyTalk. I've been in the software industry for about the last 15 years, with about half of that time focused on process optimization using Agile methodologies. If you aren't familiar with ReadyTalk, and I'm guessing a lot of you might not be, we are a 13-year-old web and audio conferencing company that is in Denver, Colorado. We have about 200 employees. And this is actually going to be a bit of a confession. Has anyone in this room been part of a team or a project that spent a lot of time building something that nobody ever used? Anybody? It's kind of a sad thing to have to admit, right? Well, that's what we did for a year and a half. We spent 18 months developing a feature for our product that nobody ever really used. So this was about 4 years ago. We had a big spike in our feature requests from our customers for video support, which is something we didn't have at the time. And our first pass at implementing this was to build a tool that would allow you to upload a clip of a video, put that into your presentation, and then you could push that during your presentation and pause it, comment on it, ask questions, or run a poll. And we thought this would be an easy place to start from a technical perspective that would allow us to build other things on top of it pretty quickly. About halfway through, we realized that we couldn't do this with Flash, so we had to start all over. Fast forward 18 months, and we finally got this out into production with a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and beer, and no one cared. So it turns out what they actually wanted, once we were like, why isn't anyone using this great thing we just put out into production? What they really wanted was a way to play back recordings from their own presentation. So to take a clip of a pre-recorded conference, insert that into a new conference, and then play that back. But what we learned in all of this was that our engineering practices and our internal processes that we were using to get our features out to market weren't working, and they were way too slow. So what we learned, in addition to the fact that our delivery side was too slow to get things out to market, was that we also knew very little about what our customers actually wanted. We had the best intentions, as everyone always does, right? We thought we knew what they needed. We thought we had all of the right solutions. But what we didn't really understand was the problem. And fast cycle time doesn't matter at all if you are delivering the wrong thing. So around this time, we decided we were going to make the switch from using Scrum to Kanban. Our goal with this was that we wanted to really focus on shorter, more incremental delivery on a regular basis, and hopefully save ourselves from another year and a half march off a cliff. So this conversion for us from Scrum to Kanban was very similar to what they talked about in the Hotels.com experience report. We started just team by team, moving teams from Scrum to Kanban. And our focus was really just initially on be faster. What do we need to do to get our teams faster? But then there were other unattended benefits, like David mentioned in the keynote this morning. People were happier, there was less stress, there was less pressure. I guarantee we weren't doing all of the things right, but I think some of the changes that we saw in moving from Scrum to Kanban were just a more even distribution of the workload. So we used the Kanban game to teach all of our teams. I've heard a couple other presenters talk about the Get Kanban game. We used that team by team. We switched from analog boards with stickies to using JIRA. JIRA helped us manage our workflow, and a big part of our move from the analog boards to JIRA was really to get a more accurate cycle time. What we were seeing with the analog boards is that folks would update their stickies at the stand-up and then never again throughout the day, so it was really hard to understand what was going on throughout the day and what work was ready to pull. So it was a big shift for us in switching to the JIRA boards. That also gave us a lot more accurate cycle time. So the team got very used to pushing back on that just one more thing. Let's just put one more thing in. We focused a lot less on filling up a backlog, and we really focused in on what is the next most important thing that we need to deliver. And we got pretty good at all this, managing flow and our work in progress. We used a concept that we like to call stale stories. So this was a button filter that we put on all of our JIRA boards so that we could keep track in stand-ups of which stories were nearing our average cycle time. So if one team was, if their average cycle time was about 10 days, they might have their stale stories filter set on 8. We would do our stand-up, hit the stale stories button, and look to see what's getting close to that time and what needs attention. And in a lot of cases, we were encouraging the teams to either swarm these stories or maybe take a look if they needed to be split into smaller stories. But this was our way of managing things that were kind of getting old on the board and not moving. So engineering got faster. We started delivering quicker. That's all the business wants, right? Engineering's always the bottleneck. And now all of a sudden, we were getting pretty good at this. Engineering was getting quick at delivering. We were getting things out the door much faster. And as everyone in this room knows, you can't optimize just one part of the system. So that's what we did. We really optimized the hell out of the engineering part of this. And then the inputs to engineering and the outputs after engineering started to say, hey, wait a minute, we can't keep up. So product couldn't come up with things fast enough for engineering, and engineering was creating a bottleneck for the marketing department in terms of launching. So we started saying, how can Kanban help these other departments at the inputs and outputs of engineering so the whole system is more efficient? So with the product side of the house, we started using Kanban to figure out what priorities were next. And our big bottleneck on the product side was really the number of product owners that we had. So we had to implement a WIP limit for how much each product owner could really manage and make sure that there was just enough work for the engineering teams to pull. On the marketing side, we worked with the marketing team to help them outline their workflow and then figured out what were the key things and how much notice did they need ahead of time from engineering so that we were giving them the notice they needed to not feel overloaded, to not feel like engineering was pushing all of the work to marketing. So we started managing all of this through our enterprise Kanban board. We do stand-ups around this board once a week by product lines. So the product lines at this time were represented by the color of the card. We had 2 different product lines that we were managing. We do stand-ups by each product line, and then on Thursdays, the entire executive team does a stand-up around this board. And what this really started to help us with was some cross-department communication, so a lot more visibility into what was coming up next, what was getting ready to go to the next team. Did they have the capacity to pull that work in? And then executive visibility into where are we spending our money as an organization? Where are all of the efforts of the different departments focused right now? So we got really focused on limiting our work in progress and getting code to customers more quickly, but we still don't know if we're building the right thing or building things that actually solve a problem for our customers. So enter the Lean Startup. So Lean, like Kanban, has deep roots in manufacturing, system efficiencies, and all these things that we already know help us get work done quicker. And while this isn't a new concept, it definitely seems like the new hot thing. But what Eric Ries did give us with his book, The Lean Startup, is a simple framework with very common language for figuring out what your customers want and doing it in a very cost-effective way. So now you've got our attention. Now we want to know, how do we do that? How do we implement this part in our Kanban system? So think back to elementary school. All of this is like a 6th grade science experiment, or maybe 2nd grade. I don't know. I went to school in the mountains. We might have been behind. But you start with a hypothesis. So what's the idea that you have? What's the thing that you think needs fixed? And then figure out a way to test it. What's the cheapest way you can get feedback on this test to prove or disprove your idea? One of my favorite examples of this I heard at the Lean Startup Conference, and there was an organization there that was testing out Elmo app. And they wanted to do some testing with toddlers, which is probably a pretty hard test group to pull together. So they were trying to figure out what's the cheapest way we can test out this iPhone app with a bunch of little kids. So they rented an Elmo suit for $100 and got a refrigerator box and took it to the mall and put fake buttons on the cardboard box and had this guy stand inside the Elmo suit. And then they just stopped families in the mall and said, hey, can we have your kid give us some feedback about this app? So it was a super cheap way to get really quick feedback and test out their ideas about how this app was going to work for kids and see if they responded to it the way they thought they would. So this is what our enterprise board looks like now. And this is where we really started to pull some of these concepts into our workflow. So some of the key changes on this board from the one you saw a couple slides back are that we split our work out now by horizons. And if you're not familiar with horizons, in the Lean Startup world, there are 3 different horizons. Horizon 1 is your current market and your current customer base. Horizon 2 is an adjacent market and adjacent customers. And Horizon 3 is creating a whole new market segment. So for us, we have very specific allocations for how much we're spending in each horizon and how much of our engineering and product resources we're dedicating to each horizon. And we can see that here through the colors on the board. So this also helps us give at a really quick glance, figure out where are we spending our efforts in each horizon. So horizon 2 is the pink cards. You can see kind of behind the arrow there, there's only one up there. That's what we expect to see. But we're not putting a whole lot into horizon 2 work right now, and that just helps us keep that in check. So our problem validation column was a new column for part of our lean startup implementation. And pretty much anything that's horizon 2 work goes through problem validation because it's not our current customer base. So we're really trying to do a lot of investigation into what is the actual problem. Things that happen in the problem validation column are surveys, a lot of customer observation, getting out of the building and really trying to go see what the customer's problems are. There's a great story from Procter & Gamble that falls into this problem validation step. They had an entire team of chemists working to try to come up with a new floor cleaning product for years. And I guess this is a very complicated thing to come up with. You don't want it to be so strong that it strips the floors or irritates the skin, but you want it to be good enough that it'll make the floor shiny and keep your house clean. So they had this team of chemists trying to come up with this cleaning product for quite a while. And then they hired a design team to come in and said, can you please help? You know, we're behind on this. So the design team said, we just want to go into people's homes and watch them clean their floors. So what they learned was, they were going into these houses and most people had already cleaned their floors. They had already mopped because people were coming into their house and they wanted it to look clean even though they were supposed to be cleaning in front of them. So the design team started accidentally spilling coffee. So they would go into these houses and just be like, oh, whoops, there's my coffee. And what they saw pretty quickly was that nobody reached for a mop. Nobody got up and was like, hold on a second, I'm gonna mop your coffee up. Everybody grabs a paper towel. And that's how Procter & Gamble invented the Swiffer. So the Swiffer came out of that whole project. And they scrapped the new floor cleaning product and went with building a new way to clean floors. So that's where problem validation comes in. It's about getting out of the building and really trying to understand what problem are you trying to solve and separating yourself from the assumptions of what you think the solution is gonna be. So from there, things move from problem validation to solution validation. And not everything leaves problem validation. We have a fair amount of cards that just die here. Solution validation, pretty much all of our work goes through solution validation. So I said Horizon 2 work always goes through problem validation. Horizon 1 work doesn't always. It's already our current customers. We have a pretty good understanding of what those customers need, what their problems are. So in some cases, those cards go straight to solution validation. Once we're in solution validation, that's where we're really trying to figure out if the idea that we have to solve the problem actually solves it. So this can be A/B testing, it could be usability testing, customer testing, but at this point we have a couple ideas of how to solve this problem. We're just trying to figure out if it works or not. And then measure. So measure is a huge part of all of the lean startup principles. And when we get to measure, we're tracking adoption and usage metrics for each card once they've already gone into production. So for us, one of the biggest learning curves in measuring was, it was pretty easy to sit down and have these meetings where we would go back and say, what was the adoption and usage for this, for this particular thing that we just implemented? And what we've started finding was, we would report back to the business, here's all the numbers, and everyone in the room was like, is that good? Is that bad? Is that what we expected? I don't know what to do with any of this. So we really had to take a step back and start to define what success looked like way back here in solution validation. So part of our exit criteria on this board for solution validation is that you have to define what success looks like when it hits measure. And that's just basically drawing a line in the sand and having a target metric for adoption and usage. And it reads just like a choose your own adventure. So it's like, if we hit this number for adoption and usage, then we add this next feature. If we don't, we back all this code out. We're not gonna leave this in production. So this has been a really big part for us in kind of holding ourselves accountable and keeping those checks and balances in our process. The other thing that happens with this measure step is that we're starting to use 5 whys on things where we didn't hit our target or didn't hit our line in the sand. So if we were gonna say we need 8,000 users to pick up this new API for this to be a valuable investment, and we don't hit that, we backtrack and say, why didn't we catch this in solution validation? And what could we have tested? What could we have done differently to try to understand the problem and the solution better so we could have delivered a solution that people were using? So what all of this is doing is helping us pivot, which is another term that comes out of the lean startup. A big piece of this and giving the business the autonomy to pivot quickly is that fast cycle time. So that's where our Kanban systems and the lean startup systems really come together. It's giving us a really quick feedback loop with customers so that we're getting the data that we need to make decisions really quickly, and then we can react to that. So now we have the ability to pivot, which gives us more flexibility and more opportunity. And then we have that enterprise board where we're constantly checking in with the executive team. And what this has really created is an opportunity every week for the business to say, we don't want to put any more money into this, let's stop. Or here's the data that backs up this idea, let's keep going forward. This has been a huge thing for getting our engineers more excited about their work, too. In the past, we've had our VP of sales and marketing super involved with our product design. And everyone constantly feels like there's a lot of churn and a lot of, I guess, gut reaction to what's happening. You know, the customer that brings in the most money, or the customer that you just talked to last, or that's yelling the loudest is typically the one who's gonna get moved up to the back of the backlog. But this really helps us check and use data to make all those decisions so that we're not just being super reactive to whoever's yelling the loudest. And all of that gives us more opportunity to pivot quickly and change our mind. So Kanban already acknowledges that a work in progress has an incurred cost, but not yet delivered any value to the customer. So this means the more work that you have in progress or that you have sitting on your board, whether it's at an enterprise level like this or at a team level, all of that stuff that's sitting there is basically feedback you haven't collected yet. It's data that you're not looking at yet. So all of this has really helped us focus on minimizing our work in progress because it helps us get feedback quicker. So the less stuff we have sitting on the board, the more feedback we have from our customers. So the combination of the cycle time focus on the Kanban board and then the lean startup practices has really helped us dial in what our customers want and getting feedback back from them pretty quickly. So like I said at the beginning, fast cycle time really doesn't matter if you're delivering the wrong thing to your customers. So both successes and failures can help you learn, but the data is really the thing that helps you make all those decisions. So focusing on delivering things quickly, getting feedback from customers quickly, and bringing these two principles together has really helped ReadyTalk be more successful in delivery. That's all I've got for you guys. Do you guys have any questions about how this was implemented? It's been probably 3 years in the making of everything I just ran through pretty quickly. We ran Scrum for about 3 years, and then, like I said, we migrated the teams over pretty slowly, and then eventually got all the teams running Kanban, and we were running at the team level for probably a year before we implemented any kind of enterprise view into that. And then we've had this for about 2. You know, I think like with any Agile, whether it's Scrum or Kanban, there's always this fear of transparency, right? Everyone holds all this information close to them because they're like, but what if it takes too long, or what if it's not right? And I don't want the entire organization to be able to see what the bottlenecks are. And I think initially when we started having these stand-ups with the entire executive team, there was a lot of fear in, I don't want my Epic card to sit here for 3 weeks and not move and have the COO standing there looking at it. So I think that the biggest hurdle was getting everybody on board with getting all that data up there, making sure it was accurate, making sure everything was there, so that they could all see what was taking place. That was probably our biggest challenge.
Hi. Minimum viable product. At what point on that board do you actually consider building something like that?
So for us, I'm going to head back to the board. These cards. So we've really messed the language up at ReadyTalk, but we call these epics. And our epic level cards are a collection of stories that have to be turned on together to deliver customer value. So that's how we break our epics out, basically. So for us, MVP might be one card, one epic. But if we have this marketing column that is broken out into waiting to turn on and waiting for launch. And I don't think there's any on here, but on the previous board, you can see the sticky dots on some of these. Those show epics that can't be released without one another. So in that case, that was a much bigger MVP, basically.
How about pain? Did you have a skill measuring the pain that you were trying to solve for?
No, we didn't, other than just a lot of, I mean, we had a lot of attrition with developers, and I think that was a big part of it. And I think just from a morale point, you know, like I said, that project that I talked about at the beginning took us 1.5 years to get out. And I think it's super deflating for everybody involved in that to know that nobody's using it or that it wasn't the right solution and that we didn't really understand what we were delivering. So a lot of this, and I think a lot of the buy-in from the organization has also been around like, let's just make sure everybody's excited and bought into what we're building. And I think once you come to the organization or come to the development team with a lot of data to back up why you're doing it, it's easy to get buy-in that way, right? You're like, 80% of the people we talked to said they want this, you know, this solution to the problem. Instead of, you know, one person or one customer yelled the loudest about this, so now we're gonna build a new thing. So that's definitely helped, but we never really measured it in a quantitative way.
Okay, hold on. Sorry, the questions need to be spoken to the mic or else we won't get it on the recording, so please wait until I reach you.
There's a mic. Great, so how involved is the delivery team with the solution validation and some of those earlier stages?
It definitely depends on the project. So for solution validation, we typically start to have some engineers. In some cases, there's a prototype that starts at solution validation, just depends on the project. I would say stuff that's going through Horizon 2 usually has a little more prototyping. Stuff that's going through Horizon 1, so it's inside of our native product already, it's customers we already know, that's usually going through more usability testing and UX design with engineers that are already pretty close to the project. So I would say there's a little bit less prototyping at that level, but they're pretty involved at that point in trying to figure out what the solutions are. Usually not an entire team, but there's definitely a couple.
Hi, my question is about tools, actually. You said you had gone online to JIRA, and I'm wondering if you had that at the enterprise Kanban level as well.
We don't right now.
Okay.
We just started using the portfolio tool inside of JIRA and are kind of testing it out at the same time that we're running the analog one. Okay. The analog one is really nice, in my opinion, given the audience that we're dealing with. So we're dealing with the whole C-suite, all the VPs that are all coming around and standing around that board. And even just the conversation of everybody standing there after and talking about, you know, what's written up there, what'd you have for breakfast? Like the conversation, it's funny, it's like a half-hour-long stand-up. It's 15 minutes of looking at the board and then 15 minutes of everybody kind of breaking off to talk about different stuff afterwards. And I think the analog board is really nice for that. We are looking at moving it into JIRA so that we can do some automatic calculations around once the first story kicks off, starting the clock, and once the last story stops, stopping the clock on cycle time at this level. But I think given the audience, you know, none of the folks that are coming to that executive level stand-up even have a JIRA license. So, but we'll probably do a little bit of both for that reason.
So for Horizon 3, when you're building an MVP, like one of the principles behind that is really getting that first sale. You know, not really getting something built yet, but actually just getting in front of the customer, making that first sale. Do you guys do anything like that to kind of determine whether or not you're actually going to go forward with build?
We have for Horizon 2, not so much for Horizon 1, but with Horizon 2, we've just done some of the price testing that you read about in the book. So we've done some of the work around testing out different pricing structures with our Horizon 2 project, where it's just as simple as having some dead links on the page that are like, would you pay for the executive tier? And then when you click on it, it's like, oh, coming soon. None of those features exist yet, but we're glad to know you'd pay for them. That's probably the extent, though, that we've done with price testing.
So I'm curious to learn how you distributed knowledge from the failed experiments or even success experiments down to the engineers.
That's a great question. So we do a lot of different tiers of retrospectives. So we do the measure meeting every 6 weeks. The product owners are responsible with coming with all that data from what's happened in production, and they usually bring that back to their individual teams in the team level retrospectives. The teams are also looking at, their cycles on a regular basis, and we let the teams pick how often they're gonna do them, but they're checking in on their individual delivery metrics and how they're doing against the goals of the epic on a regular basis. So they're looking at the metrics for adoption and usage, and we really try. It was probably about a year ago, we asked our product owners to really stop writing super detailed epics, which I know might seem kind of baffling, but the engineers really felt like they were being handed a solution. Just go implement this solution. So now we try to write these in a way where it's like, here's the problem we're trying to solve for the customer, here's the things we know about that problem, and here's the way we're gonna measure the success. Now you guys figure out the solution. So we take that to the teams and really give them a lot more autonomy of figuring out and crafting the solution to the problem on their own.
Speaking about the epics, I was curious, could you describe the cards, like what the colors mean? What are the different markups you have on them? Like, I'm assuming estimate might be in there, but maybe there's a lot of different things that you're marking on those.
Yeah, so we just have the epic, and these are pretty hard to see. So currently, we're using the horizons to differentiate the cards, and then use case. So yellow and blue are both horizon 1 and 2 different use case scenarios or product lines. And then the pink one up there is a horizon 2 card. So that's kind of our difference between the colors right now. The things we're tracking on here are basically start date, target release date, who's the team, who's the product owner. And then if there are epics that are tied together and have to be turned on at the same time, we'll mark those with the sticky dots to just kind of show that all of those have to sit here and waiting. We call this waiting for on. We try to do continuous deployment with a lot more of our work now. So stories are getting released into production on a regular basis, just shut off. So cards will sit in build until every story is in production. Once every story is in production, it'll go to launch. I mentioned, creating a bottleneck for marketing, and this was a lot of feedback that we got from them, that they felt like it was all of a sudden like, hey, we have all this work and it's all gonna get turned on Friday. And they were like, we didn't have time, we didn't know all this was coming, we have all this stuff to do. So we're really trying to create more of a pull system for them, or once the epic goes here, they tell us when they're ready to turn it on, and they can queue up there until they're ready to launch it. Behind the switch, yeah. We don't for this. We do at the team levels. They have an expedited column for production issues. I think that's the only different class of service they really have outside of just stories. But yeah, each of these cards represents a collection of stories that's in their board in JIRA.
So I had a question on this enterprise board. You mentioned that the first column, you have a lot of stories that fall out here. How do you measure that loss, or that, how do you track the cycle time for that lead step up to it?
So for, I don't actually feel like we have a great process for tracking this right now. So this is fairly new for us. We review these cards that hit problem validation. So we've lost 2 product strategists in the last 6 months. So we're down to 1. That's why the whip is nice and low here, because we've only got 1 person doing all of this, unfortunately. But the person who owns the product strategy step owns a lot of this problem validation set. And so every other week we check in and try to look at what is queued up next, what failed. She measures a lot of that using a tool called Lean Launch Lab that kind of organizes all of your hypotheses and your tests that you've run and what's passed and failed. And we use that tool to check in on all of the experiments that are taking place here. So just like the build cards kind of expand into stories in JIRA, that problem validation card expands into the individual tests in Lean Launch Lab.
So just a follow-up then. So would you try to do some retrospectives with this person and where they got the initial idea, concept, and figure out why these things are just falling out before we can, you guys can decide to do them?
Yeah, it's not something we're doing a ton of retrospectives on right now, but I mean, there's definitely a learning opportunity that's probably, we could definitely take more advantage of there in terms of what stuff's falling out. I think a lot of it is just going back to that idea of it's easy to come to the table with a proposed solution. I think that's where a lot of us start in this industry. We have an idea of what's going to fix something, and it's trying to reframe that solution into what problem are you trying to solve. And then when you back into what problem are you trying to solve, it expands into what assumptions do you have about the solution, and what other things could you possibly be testing that might also contribute either to disproving those assumptions or to disproving the solution that you've kind of got in the back of your mind. So that's problem validation really expands out that way for us, but I think there's a lot of opportunity that's still new and untapped here.
Ooh, great segue. Do you have, so yeah, you were talking about giving the developers like more of a context around the problem to solve. Do you have user experience people at the company? And if so, like, where are they involved in this process?
Most of their involvement comes in solution validation. So in problem validation, we're still really trying to do customer observation and surveys. It's a lot more qualitative than it is quantitative at this point. Our user experience designers are heavily involved in solution validation. So that's where a lot of our customer testing is taking place. It's where they're getting super involved in trying to look at wireframes. In some cases, A/B testing might be taking place if it's some of the Horizon 1 work, but a lot of the user experience stuff happens there before it gets to build. Not to say that they're not still pretty heavily involved with the individual development teams, but at that point, it's probably more tweaks and actual designs that they're just handing off to the team than it is trying to understand what the solution looks like.
Yeah. Oh, so how do you maintain the balance between your different horizons? What's the decision process around that? And how do you measure?
So we check in on this. We do roadmap steering quarterly, and we check in on our numbers on a monthly basis and a quarterly basis in kind of different tiers of meetings. Our initial goal this year was to spend between 10 and 20% in Horizon 2 and the remainder in Horizon 1. And then hopefully next year, look at allocating a little bit more of that to Horizon 3. We're not putting any money or time into Horizon 3 right now. But so we just use these epics and an epic count to roughly estimate out how many things are going through each different horizon. For the most part, the Horizon 2 allocation right now is one developer. So we have one developer. I would say probably 80% of our product strategy person's time on Horizon 2, but it's just one developer and one UX person probably 50% of the time working on that stuff for us right now. But our goal is definitely to start to ramp that up as we prove out that this process works for us, that we're getting the feedback that we want, and that we're investing our money in a productive way. Okay.
I have a question about this board too. Do you have like a definition of done or a definition of ready on each of the vertical lines? So for example, you're done with validation because like 1, 2, 3, and you're ready for solution validation because 1, 2, 3.
We do. It's posted right here. We have it on the side of the board, but we did go through the process with we did a lot of that planning with the doers for each step. So we had a couple meetings, and every time we tweak the board, we kind of come back and revisit. In the previous version of it, you can see we had define and develop separate. And we used to have a phase here of definition where that was where the UX person and the product owners would really sit down and try to write up all the stories, come up with everything that fell underneath that epic. What we found when our board looked like this was that almost none of these cards got pulled into develop. So we would spend all this time on define, and then right before we would start a new cycle, we would put a new card in develop that never even really sat here. So that really made us revisit, like, what are we doing with this column, and why are we spending so much time defining things that we're not even pulling into that column? So we rolled, and in this old version of the board, we had our exit criteria at the top. But we got rid of that define column so that now define happens when it hits build. We're not spending any time doing any upfront definition. Once the team pulls it in, that's when they're defining the stories. So it's more of a commitment to knowing that the work's definitely going to take place. I think we have time for one more. No more? All right, thanks you guys. My info's up here.